So I'm really pleased to be able to facilitate this session talking about alignment of regulatory work and reimbursement. This is a big issue that we're trying to grapple with in the Canadian context. So first I'll introduce the panelists. Dr. Hans-Georg Eichler is from the European Medicines Agency. And I think when we tend to look at kind of practices that could be adopted within Canada, we tend not to look south, we tend to look across the ocean and we see what our European colleagues are doing. There's a lot of similarity between some of the reimbursement systems and some of the challenges that are happening within Canada. So we have a great opportunity for Hans to be here and share some of his experiences and give us his insight on this particular topic. Beside him is Dr. Robyn Lim, and she's with Health Canada. And obviously, a very important body for us to be working with. Robyn has done a lot of work looking at regulations, policy development within Health Canada, and we're looking obviously to partner with her and her organization in order to help facilitate some of the potential changes that we can do to sort of speed up some of the access and timeliness to medication, which we've heard from the other panels about is so important for patients and healthcare providers. Mr. John Helou is with Pfizer Canada. He's the president and the Canadian lead of internal medicine with Pfizer. Obviously, manufacturers are a very important stakeholder when we're having these discussions, and we'll be hearing from him around the importance of streamlining a number of these processes in order to help facilitate timeliness and access to medications. And finally, we have Michele Evans, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister in Alberta with the Pharmaceutical and Supplementary Benefits Division. And she'll be providing input and insight on the panel from a payer perspective in managing these particular issues. So I think we've heard a lot in the panels this morning and also yesterday around timeliness of medication, extremely important for patients, healthcare providers. The topic of today is measuring value in theory in the real world, and in some respects, time is a bit of a value for folks. I don't know if that necessarily equates to an exact value, but we know that timeliness is extremely important. I thought maybe just before we get started, I'll give a very quick snapshot on the approval process in Canada, just in case people aren't familiar. We know that it's a very dynamic environment. It's an extremely complex environment, and I think from all of the discussions you've heard over the last couple of days, you know that this is not an easy topic for us to grapple with. It's an important topic, but I think just keeping it in context a bit, there are three main areas across the system that need to come together from a approval process to a reimbursement process. And although we've called the topic alignment of regulatory and reimbursement, I think what we're talking more about is not necessarily alignment exactly, but are there ways for us to streamline some of these processes so that we can all be more efficient? So as many of you may know, on the drug side, Health Canada does review a submission from the manufacturer, and they provide what's called a notice of compliance. So you may hear the term NOC or NOCC, which is a notice of compliance with conditions. So there may be a few acronyms that are thrown around in a bit of the discussion today. Once they've given that approval, that's authorization to enter into the Canadian marketplace. CADTH and INES, we evaluate the new technologies as they come forward, and we provide recommendations through to the payers who make the final funding decision. So it's a very complex system, but we can sort of fit it into three boxes of processes when we're looking at this. And I think what we have a tendency to do is pick a little bit on a particular entity and focus on that entity, and instead sort of step back a little bit and say, well, what actually can we do to improve the processes or the streamlining or the efficiencies across those various entities so that we can deal with some of the issues such as timeliness for access to these products. So we have a series of questions. I'm going to open up with one question to each of our panelists, and then we'll obviously be opening it up to the floor. So Again, be provocative. We want to have a very stimulating conversation to close off the session. And so for the first one, Hans, as I said, we do often look to the European experiences. And we know, you've heard from this morning's panelists, again, and I'm repeating myself, but there's this desire for many stakeholders to have immediate access to new medications. And there's a lot of discussions around streamlining the licensing processes, the reimbursement processes. So can you ever see us just moving right to a future state? Let's just jump to the very end. And could we not just get to that state where both the regulatory, the HTA, and the payer decisions are all just done at the exact same time? So why do we have to be sequential? Why can't we just jump to that state and just have one point of decision, and that's all that's made?
So you asked me to be provocative. Let me be so. When you say at the same time, that could mean many different things. Loosely speaking, it could mean, well, why don't we roll all these processes into one? What's wrong? We have a bunch of experts here and a bunch of experts there. Let's simply do one decision that allows a drug on the market and also decides on reimbursement. And I heard that sometimes being said in Europe, where we have these solidarity-based healthcare systems, 99% of the entire drug bill for these new products are paid anyway by third-party payers. So what's the point of having these two decision makers? That's one way of reading this, and I give you my first answer. It's provocative. I don't think this is a very good idea. And I am, like everybody else in this room, a future patient, or a current, I'm a future patient. Would I like to see that happen? No. Why? It is the easiest thing for a decision maker is to tell industry, oh, you need more data. Sorry, please come back in 2 years' time, do another study. We aren't there yet, there's a safety signal here. We're not clear about the comparative effect of that. So if you had one decision maker that always had in the back of their minds the budget impact, what would that mean for the benefit risk assessment? It wouldn't bode well. And if I was in industry, I would be worried about that. So I would argue that the two decisions, looking at only the clinical side, the benefit risk, versus should we pay for this and for who, should remain separated. We shouldn't contaminate one with the other. What I see happen in Europe now, and this is emerging as we speak really, is that these two decision makers act as checks and balances in an open society and watch over each other. So if the payer thinks that drug should never have come our way because we cannot afford it, then it's the obligation of the regulator to say, no, wait a minute, it may be too expensive, but this is a good product. We want it. And vice versa, if the regulator gets too permissive, then the payer would, and that happens now in Europe, tell them, wait a minute, what are you allowing on the market here? So keep that separated. When you say at the same time, I could also interpret this strictly in a temporal sense. And I would say absolutely. What we have, and you described that for Canada, we have exactly the same in the European member states. If the drug is allowed on the market on day 0, then the whole reimbursement assessment process starts again, and we're losing a year, half a year, whatever the case may be. That is white space. Nobody benefits from that. Could we bring those 2 points in time, the decision about licensing and the decision about reimbursement, closer together? Absolutely. This is a logistic issue. We're trying to shorten that white space by sharing information. We can talk about that later on. Yeah, but there is no good reason why it should be so far apart from each other. And one other thing that we could probably align, that is the evidence standards. I think it is only a measure of inefficiency of a healthcare environment if the regulator says the company should do this type of study and the HTA body or payer says, no, you should do a different type of study, different endpoint because we're looking at that. Those two bodies should get their act together and say, okay, can we agree on what information we need, how much information is enough? That is not to say we roll the decisions into one, but the assessment basis, the clinical data, that can be aligned.
Great, thank you. Robyn, so as I mentioned, we often look to other jurisdictions to see kind of what changes they're making. Some of the, we've talked about things like adaptive pathways, similar to what Hans is mentioning about trying to align some of the data requirements for approvals across the entire system. Can you talk a little bit about how Health Canada has been looking at some of these initiatives, and are there sort of lessons learned that we should be taking and applying to our own approval frameworks from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brent. We've been actually involved in quite a few of these international sort of exercises for about 10 years now. Some of you may recall the progressive licensing initiative that Health Canada was initiated back in late 2006-07, and that actually in itself proposed a flexible approach that was stakeholder sort of system-wide, and so that sort of kick-started this sort of introduction into the larger community to discuss these things. And so we've been very consciously continuing to be involved in those other aspects around the world, both with other regulators as well as with HTAs and payers and global industry, to try to work together, because we know we need to stay in step. I mean, this is not, it can't be parochial anymore. What we're trying to bring back to that, we've already had some very measurable outcomes from that. A lot of that work has informed the sheltering legislation under Vanessa's law, which you may be familiar with, that was passed here as a modernization of the Food and Drugs Act a few years ago. And a lot of that work, the scientific and technical and policy work behind these initiatives you've been describing, are actually recognized in that framework, so that framework can shelter these modernizations that will be occurring. We're also involved, we're actually participating in developing those frameworks. And what we want to do is not just bring that back to Health Canada for policy development, but actually put it into the real world of operations. And while I'm now currently doing policy, I actually do come from 10 years of ops in review and decision-making at that sharp end. So we're actually even now speaking with our review colleagues about how to change the culture and the mindset and perceptions about these frames and how important our decisions are. Not just, to tick a box and say we've done our day's work, but those downstream decisions rely on some of the things that we write about in our decisions, not to mention the policy tools that we have in which to do that work. So we're actually working very actively right now to build new policy tools as well as build new mindsets in operations.
I think from this morning's discussion, the whole notion of engagement and bringing people together to have those conversations, so it's great to hear Health Canada is working in that. John, can you speak a little bit about why is this so important from the pharmaceutical industry perspective to have some of this, you call it streamlining again, and maybe speaking a bit to Hans' comment about minimizing the white space that sometimes happens between the regulatory and a decision-making process?
It's not going to be that controversial because I agree with a lot of what Hans actually mentioned. I'd like to offer a little bit of slightly different perspective on this. First of all, a Canadian who's going to be utilizing these services not that long from now. So I want to make sure the best minds in the House, best minds that are here, are solving for these problems for all of us, including myself. So not only am I leading an organization, I am a part of an important stakeholder group that is designing what the future of healthcare needs to be in Canada. I'm a firm believer in that. Second, as a head of a business, I advocate on behalf of Canada as a market where products need to come to because patients can benefit from those. And in the discussions that I've been a part of today, we're losing sight of that. And I think we should never lose sight of that, all right? We should never allow Canada to be deprioritized based on inefficiencies that exist in the systems that we currently have. We created those. To the concept of white space, it was less than 10 years ago that white space was just a few months. I remind you, less than 10 years ago, that white space was less than a few months. Today, from first launch anywhere in the world until 80% of Canadian patients in the public sector have access to the innovation is between 3 and 3.5 years. Folks, we're all working for the same thing. We want to make sure that patients are getting access to the innovation. And my thought on this is that cycle of innovation is not complete until the patient gets access to it. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think we've come a long way. I'm not suggesting we need to go back to where we were before, because the level of sophistication, the values that are being introduced by each of the organizations is paramount. We just need to find a more efficient way of doing it. So Canadian rankings is higher on the global scale. Right now we rank 17 out of 20 in adoption of new innovations, and that's absolutely unacceptable. Unacceptable for me as a Canadian, regardless of what I was doing. Regardless, I could be doing this job or something else. So I think we need to improve our standing, and I think stakeholder engagement, the comment that was made earlier this morning, this is not about checking the box. Stakeholder engagement is about co-creation. Co-creation means you're engaged on the ground level, developing the plans together in a trustworthy, open environment, both of us striving for exactly the same thing. Time is money. For the metastatic breast cancer patient that was here this morning as a part of her association, it was heart-wrenching for her to tell me that they're losing memberships faster than they could advocate. That's really sad. So time is money, and we need to bring those faster to market. So as an industry representative, I'm happy to roll up my sleeves and to be a part of this design or future design, future end state. It's critically important.
It's great. Thank you very much. So Michele, we sort of had our question preempted a little bit by Dev, but one of the questions I think we tend to hear, sort of in a rather cynical manner, is that payers, in some respects, don't really want to improve the timelines because that means they're going to have to make faster decisions. We know that the cost of many of these new therapies have increased quite substantially over the last few years. So it could almost be a little bit of a strategy for the payers to sort of slow things down a little bit so that the fiscal hit doesn't actually quite hit them this fiscal year and they can plan for it maybe a little bit next year. Can you maybe comment a little bit on that statement and reflect a little bit on what you've heard across the panel so far?
Sure. So I think it would be disingenuous for me to not acknowledge that we know time is money. And we certainly understand that the choices we're making do have fiscal implications, both for us as well as for our partners in the industry, and implications for the care that patients are getting. So while I would reject the notion that we explicitly delay things or introduce delays for the purposes of managing budgets, we do know that there is money on the table, and that those choices that we're making have implications for a lot of different players in the room. So I think, it can't just be about time, though. It can't just be about how fast we make those decisions. I think it's important that we think about what the high-performing drug programs around the world, high-performing systems are looking at beyond just time. Time is an element, and the faster we do things, that's important. But we have to be making good decisions, and we have to be making sure we're considering all of the metrics around those choices. So I would rather take some more time to make sure we make the right choices for the most people to benefit based on our constraints that we have to work within. Just like time is money, we only have so much time in terms of the resources we have. We only have so many dollars publicly to spend, and there are opportunity costs if we spend those in the way that we don't get the greatest return. So yes, we know, but I don't think it's an explicit strategy that any payer wants to take. We start from a place of we want to make sure we are making those innovations, those products available where there is evidence to support that's an improvement for our health systems overall and for patients.
Thanks, Michele. So as I mentioned, we'll certainly open it up to the floor. If people have other questions, feel free to participate in our this closing session. I do want to maybe go back to one of the points that you raised, John, about the time to listing. And I think there's a lot of emphasis. There's people that are focusing on counting down the number of days between Health Canada's approval and a reimbursement decision. There's reporting that's done across the industry To your point about the 3.5 years potentially for having 80% of the patients getting access for first entrant. Part of that, I think, is also the Canadian context. We know sometimes we're not always the first country to get submissions for these files. They may go to the FDA or the EMA ahead of Health Canada. So from a practical standpoint, do you think there's things within the manufacturer's sort of span of control that they can help facilitate some of this maybe exchange of information so that we can specifically reduce some of these timelines?
So it's a great question, and absolutely, we could do a lot. I think it's important to provide a little bit of context. Many Canadian organizations, subsidiaries of multinational organizations, have centralized a lot of their operations out of their, whether it's Europe or it's in the US. Years ago, we used to file simultaneously to Health Canada and FDA. Years ago. It was a priority goal for us to file simultaneously. With the lack of harmonization initiatives at Health Canada, the complexity that is required to customize submissions for Health Canada means that now it's a deprioritized market to number 4. We go FDA first, EMA second, Japan third, Canada fourth. So there's a couple of initiatives where if we could continue to work with Health Canada on harmonizing the practices, pick either the FDA or EMA, but just pick one, and let's harmonize those, it would make a huge impact in reducing time to when patients get access to their medicines. So that's one aspect. The second piece of it is request for information, whether it is at the health technology assessment piece or whether it is from Health Canada. And the professor mentioned to this earlier. The data queries that we end up getting are crunched in a very, very short period of time and require significant level of customization. Whether it is a Clarifax from Health Canada that we require still to respond to those, so we recommend that we have an interim step, more frequent conversation. That would be of tremendous value. Or on the HTA side, CADTH's perspective, to recustomize the submission to meet the requirements of HTA. If we could simplify that, there's huge level of efficiencies that could be gained. So I honestly believe there are solutions. We just need to sit together and say, is it absolutely necessary? Most of the times we're rushing to comply because we don't want to miss a deadline around that. So I believe we could do a significant amount in that regard.
Robyn, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on a variety of things and try to pull it in a slightly different way. Maybe I'll be provocative and say, maybe it isn't just about streamlining, maybe it really is trying to align more. But I'd like to think it's beyond just blind processes that we align. We've talked a lot in this symposium about defining value and all the different definitions of value, and maybe that's one of the problems. But there's another way to think about that, which is the objectives of the system and the individual players within the system. And frankly, to us, the fundamental objective is optimized patient outcomes, and that's outcomes of all patients. So that speaks to the system as well. The other definitions of value that are provided in the symposium notes, for example, patient preferences and innovation and access and all of those are actually, they're very real and they're very real aspects of value, but they're actually the means objectives to get to the fundamental objective. So if we could really focus on understanding the map of what those values look like and where we all play our parts from the very beginning, I think that would help. And for us, one way to define, in my head, value, from my perspective, is, and that would perhaps help align not just evidence needs, but maybe at some level, decisions a little more, and at least raise the floor, if not the ceiling, is when you can have an actual demonstrated need for a product, so it's not just another thing which, apart from the therapeutic options issue, but you have an actual real gap in the clinical environment and the patients really need something, plus a drug that performs well, that demonstrates benefit with adequate safety issues, the whole benefit harm uncertainty thing, and interpretable evidence. So if you can actually align or get as much as you can and build that up front, that would actually help, I think, the payers, the HTAs, because then you're trying to see the bits together and put the jigsaw together. And one of the things we're working on right now is some of the nuts and bolts about how processes might actually help you turn through those discussions on a case-by-case basis right up front.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any comments, Hans, on that piece?
I know better than talk about intra-Canadian issues as an outsider.
But you have the unbiased opinion, and
So, harmonization can mean two things, and whether that is across regulators, so Health Canada, FDA, EMA, or whether that is between regulator and HTA, there's the process side, and then there is the different evidence standards. So what do you require, what do I require? Do we have room for improvement on the process side? Yes, absolutely. I think we haven't been very good at harmonizing our timelines, etc. It's more difficult to speak to the evidence standard side. We hear from the industry, and that I'm speaking for EMA now. What you just said, why can FDA, and by implication Health Canada and EMA, not come to the same standards? And there are, in some cases, entrenched views that we stand by the differences we have. So we all know that FDA wants this for diabetes drugs and EMA wants that. We're not trying to remedy that, and maybe that is a good idea also between regulators and payers. In certain high-stakes indications, and the classic one is antimicrobial resistance, because everybody recognizes this is a priority field, and there, the regulators, wherever they are on the globe, and maybe also the payers and other decision makers, have really a high-stake interest to harmonize. So I see that as the thin end of the wedge for harmonization. Maybe that is the right way to start that. But I'll stop here and leave it to my Canadian colleagues to fight that out amongst yourself.
It's 11.
well, we want a good fight at the end of the day, don't we? No. So this question is actually more around confidential pricing, around product listing agreements, but I want to sort of take it up a little bit. Hans, there's been a lot of effort at the EMA around transparency of data and allowing access to some of the information that is submitted to support approvals. Can you maybe talk a little bit about sort of how has transparency helped towards some of these discussions around harmonization and working more closely with the payer environment and the HTA environment?
So by way of background, the EMA was embroiled in a debate in Europe, very political, about transparency, usually of clinical trial data. And we changed our mindset about 4 or 5 years ago and said, okay, we're fully behind that transparency. All the clinical trial data that companies submit to us are in the public domain by definition. Not everybody in industry liked that, but by now this is common practice. And I think the whole world is now accepting that. The payers and the HTA bodies sort of supported us a bit. They were very happy that this happened. And they say, yeah, we like it. We are behind that because now we can also use your data if it's in the public domain. So will it help? Yes, a bit. But I think what will move the needle is something else. If we talk about time and white space. The payers in Europe tell us, you regulators, only tell us what will come our way on the last day when the decision is made. Then we see the label, we see whether the drug is approved and for who it is approved. And that is very important for us. So we can start our work only on day 0. And because we have a regulation in Europe that says the payers only have so much time, the public payers, to take their decision, that puts them under pressure. So what we are now in the process is finding an agreement between the sponsor company, the regulator, and the payers to share the data long before we reach the final decision, so that they can start their work before day 0. And that should help reduce the white space, hopefully in the near future.
I think that's absolutely key. I think the sharing of the information as quickly as possible is the only thing that's really going to be able to sort of move the target a little closer toward that. John, can you maybe comment a little bit on that around from an industry perspective? Because I think often, and maybe wrongly so, there's comments around, well, this is proprietary, we can't share. And I think obviously it's the manufacturer that is a key component in this discussion as the owner of these submissions around how some of this information flows. Can you comment maybe a bit on the transparency, and has there been a reaction to some of the stuff that the EMA has done that has also been discussed within Canada?
First of all, at a global level, as was just mentioned, all companies now are pretty lined up. I would be surprised if there is a single company that is not sharing their clinical data after it is filed on clinicalgov.com. It's all there. So 18 months after primary completion, we submit to a peer-reviewed journal. At the outset, we register all the information on clinicaltrial.gov and EU DRACT as well. After completion of the study results for adult study, within 1 year, they could become available in the public domain. For pediatrics, 6 months. So we're doing a lot of that work. And any queries that is coming in from investigators that want to look at the data and analyze it on their own, they could apply. And if it's a legitimate request, there's an independent party, governing body, and I think there's 1 or 2 Canadians on it, that will review those requests and provide that data so that you can look at it. So from that perspective, it is available and it's there. The one thing I'd like to comment on is around the sort of the various roles of both Health Canada that play a critical role and the HTA environment, and the sharing of the data and the information and the transfer of that, and at what point in time. I think we need to go back to sort of very important principles, and that is, what are we trying to solve for? Are we trying to solve for improving efficiencies by 30, 50, 75%? Or are we trying to establish cost effectiveness measurements early on in the process? So we need to define what it is that we're working on. Second thing I think it's important is for us to establish some guiding principles that we would operate under. Guiding principles that I would think we ought to consider is that there's unique functional roles that are extremely strong, and they need to stay that way. They need to be respected and not diluted for Health Canada and for HTA. It is really important. Imagine for a day if a phase 2 trial for unmet medical need is going through an accelerated approval through Health Canada. I know what the answer is going to be from an HTA perspective. We don't have enough data to be able to make a recommendation on this. I would hate for studies like that and innovations like that not to be able to make it through to patients that need it. So the guiding principles really is important. We need to make sure that we respect the strength that each group brings into this equation. Health Canada, safety, efficacy, and quality, and the HTA environment, cost effectiveness and value. And I think those are important pillars from a Canadian perspective.
So maybe building a little bit upon that, and so obviously there's got to be a lot of engagement across the various sectors in order to get that product out into the market as quickly as possible. And we've had some discussions around timeliness of data, and if, for example, the regulator does approve it based on, I'm going to say, less mature data than what we've typically seen in the past. One of the issues I think that often comes up then is there needs to be some sort of mandate or planning process around trying to collect some of that additional information. And it almost kind of gets into the realm of reassessments. Should we be looking at doing some of these reviews at different points in time, doing an initial assessment of the data that's there? It may fail on the cost effectiveness side, but I think there is often in those discussions a recognition that there may be more data that's coming forward. Now, the risk to that is people will say, well, if there's new data coming forward, why don't we wait till then, and then we know for sure what the information is going to be. But if we're trying to be a bit more risk-taking in some of this stuff, you could almost do a conditional type of an approval with the commitment to collect some of this information. But I think there is a real fear that once it's out there, and how do you potentially control the utilization, and how do you make sure that the information or the data that we're going to get is going to come in at a later point in time. And it can't be 5 years from now. It's got to be, a couple of years from now, because we all know if something's out in the market for 5 years, it's already entrenched itself within a clinical practice realm. So I'll open it up to any of you to talk a bit about, from the various perspectives, what needs to be in place to ensure that that information does get collected, so that maybe that discussion of risk or this perception that we're trying to get around a system dissolves, and we can move forward with some of these innovative approaches to reimbursement and approvals. Robyn, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I like to think that actually the last few years and into the next few years is actually a transitional era. There are so many multidimensional innovations happening technologically, scientifically, politically, societally. We've got patient-focused development coming online, which is terrific. We have life cycle-based considerations and real-world evidence also coming online, and that's great. But none of these are actually mature yet. They're actually in development as we speak, independently, and we're literally seeing this multidimensional flux and change. And when it comes to decisions and evidence needs, it comes down to confidence and doubt, which is the opposite, of course, which is why we're so very careful as the regulator now in our new frameworks to be talking about benefits and harms and uncertainties, because we understand how important it is, if we want to try to start talking together and making decisions, to articulate what are the still remaining known uncertainties, let alone the ones you don't know. But you can't plan forward unless you know what it is you don't know now. So, for example, under Vanessa's law, one of the sets of regulations that's going to be coming online is one around terms and conditions on license. We talked in PL a long time ago about a life cycle planning, a life cycle evidence plan, where you try to measure that out. Internationally, we're trying to work on how do you do seamless, pre to post authorization methods. What are you doing at peri-authorization? But your willingness to offset that evidence at peri-authorization is going to depend on your confidence in those innovations at that point on a case-by-case basis to actually get that information. And it's also going to depend on, if it doesn't work out, how can you reverse or tune the decisions. And then that's going to require a larger and perhaps thorny discussion around the social contract that you need for everybody's talking about shared decision-making and the stakeholders ring and who's going to do what. And you've talked about the roles and maintaining those, and that is going to be really important. But we're going to need to have those discussions as a system, at least on a case-by-case basis, what we're going to do around the terms and conditions and if they can't be met. But that's going to require you to know right up front what you still don't know, how you're going to get it, the kind of time frame, and then what will happen depending on whether you get that information or not.
Hans?
So, thanks, Robyn, for reminding me that I should give kudos to my Canadian colleagues. Let me explain. We always pretended, let's go back 5-10 years ago. We always pretended we assess the benefits and the harm of a product. When we are satisfied, we know it's good, we let it on the market. There was a dirty word, the embarrassing relative, so to speak, in regulation, and it was called uncertainty. And I remember years ago, I wanted to write the word uncertainty somewhere, and other people in my colleagues said, no, don't do that. People will lose trust if we say that there are uncertainties around what we do, which was wrong and paternalistic. And it took us a long time to come to grips, and now we use that term. And I want to congratulate Canada, is, to my knowledge, the first jurisdiction that has that dirty word in their legislation, which is a great accomplishment, because we haven't been honest. Much of what we do is managing uncertainty. There was always uncertainty around what we did. And Vioxx was the great reminder that we didn't know everything. So you asked the question, should we revise our assessments, be it a regulatory or be it a reimbursement decision? And the obvious answer is a no-brainer, is yes. As we reduce uncertainty, as we grow knowledge, of course we should go back, and say, okay, maybe we should widen the treatment-eligible population or narrow it to zero, which is tantamount to withdrawing it from the market. And the same, obviously, has to go for reimbursers. If you find that the product doesn't deliver as much value as you thought it did, should the price come down if you believe in value-based pricing? The answer is yes. If there is more value, should it go up? The answer is yes. So we will have to learn to live with revising our own decisions from last year, 2 years ago, in the best interest of everybody. Everything else is dishonest and, dare I say, not very intelligent.
So let's talk about the dirty word, Michele. And from a payer perspective, the issue around uncertainty, and it has huge implications around, to your point, around can you reasonably expand, restrict, move? Like, how does that play in your space?
So for me, I think having the conversation about uncertainties is really important, because I actually challenge some of the stuff I heard from John that we won't make decisions on phase 2 evidence, that he knows the foregone conclusion. We make decisions all the time in the face of uncertainties. We have to make those decisions to spend the money, and I think we do need to be creating systems and structures that are more responsive to the pace of change and the pace of information development that we have in the system today that maybe didn't exist in the past. So we should be looking at whether or not, if there's more evidence that proves these products have more values, allowing for an increased price. We should, though, equally be able to disinvest in technologies and therapies that are not meeting those values. And that is something that is very difficult at this point in time to do. Trying to stop doing something that we've started is very, very difficult for a number of reasons in the system, in terms of patient expectations and what about how it impacts me personally. So I think we do need to get better at disinvestment to create the space to allow for some of these new products to come in. We do just have to have a more adult conversation about uncertainties, I think.
So how, we don't have a patient that's on this panel. From that perspective, though, how would you engage the patient community or the clinician community if you do have to make some of those decisions around uncertainty and potentially look at either rolling back a benefit or trying to tighten up some particular access?
You know, Brent, I think it's just about being clear about our structures and our processes and how we're making those decisions. And it goes back to making sure we have those clear principles, that we have them involved at the different tables, and that we're having the conversations with them. So it's not easy, it takes time. And I guess that's the point that I would make is, as much as we want to compress our times and close out the white space, collaboration, working together, having these conversations means taking the time to build the trust, to build the comfort with all of the different interests, and then having the courage to move forward with the tough choices, even though not everyone will agree.
Robyn?
Jumping off a few of these points and getting back to streamlining or making it shorter or reducing the white space, can I argue that it's not just what we do, and you mentioned the words safety, efficacy, quality, and we've talked about benefit risk or benefit harm uncertainty. And the old model, and we're now in transition space, but the old model was you developed it around determining efficacy, which was that contrived world stuff, safety, which was, well, we're not doing it to power it for that, but we'll sort of look at the safety profile. And quality, of course, has to be there, otherwise you don't have either of the first two. And then you kind of do your benefit risk thing, which is now benefit harm uncertainty. And then you do your value thing. So, but if you do those sequentially, that's how you get more white space. So if you could actually be much more strategic in drug development right from the get-go to actually try to drive to explore value or explore true benefit and potential benefit and harm in a really context meaningful way, because arguably in the old model, SEQ or safety, efficacy, quality was very context blind. What we want is meaningful evidence that means something. And for example, in the benefit risk world, benefit isn't just efficacy, it's also improved safety. You could actually start looking at outcome measures in studies that weren't just about counting up adverse events or change from baseline across the population for something. You could actually be starting to measure things like, did this therapy prevent rehospitalization? You could start looking at more downstream health system outcome measures, which may line things up more for some of the other downstream decision makers, and not just sort of wait to fill the white space after the fact when you had opportunities up front for real patient-focused development and system-focused development. So you could line up what your outcome measures should be with what everybody needs to be able to interpret the evidence.
John?
If I can
Michele?
build on some of the pieces that Robyn said too. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we sort of parallel process these and some of the challenges we're seeing is because on the back end of the health system, when we're making choices about what we will fund, we're just not that enamored by the value that we're seeing brought to market. So as much as you see these incremental innovations or even significant innovations, is it worth it to the system? And those are the tough choices where we do have constrained resources. We do not have unlimited budgets to spend on everything. And so if the innovation isn't cost effective, and that's, we've spent all this time developing these tools, these HTA mechanisms to assess that, I think we do need to put a lot of stock into, is it worth it? Is this benefit worth the price we are paying for these? And it's not always the case.
John?
Just a couple of things, and those are, again, thought-provoking ideas. Health Canada has a notice of compliance with conditions process. What if we actually brainstormed around what would it take to have a reimbursement with conditions? That could change over time. I think we're smart enough, we can come up with something. I don't know what it would look like. I have no idea. But I think we can learn. I bet you, whenever you would know a lot more than I would probably because you have the history with the organization, the debate that went on to make that decision to allow a notice of compliance with conditions to be put in place. We're at that moment in time for HTA. Can we leverage that particular avenue?
Great. Hans?
Two comments to what my co-panelists just said. You spoke about what is cost effective and what a shame if a company develops that and then you find it's just incremental and there is no way it can be cost effective. And I agree, that can happen and that does happen. So a sharing experience. We have now almost as a routine procedure these parallel scientific advices where companies that develop a product come to the EMA and there's also HTAs in the room and we all discuss the plans. There was a company who developed a diabetes drug and they were aiming to show that blood glucose control will be a margin better than what we have today. And the HTA bodies in the room were very forthright and said, look guys, if all you show is that this is 1% better than the previous one, forget the idea you will ever get a premium price. And we later heard from the company representatives that that was a wake-up call. And they reconsidered the decision to either develop the product at all, because if there isn't more it can do, we don't need that, or if they have to aim higher and show something better. And I think that is a fair comment. But for that, the HTA bodies or payers should be in the room and should be willing to contribute to the process early on. That was my first comment. The second comment that you just made, could we have conditional reimbursement? We call that managed entry agreements, and they come in many shapes or forms. And absolutely, should we go and do that? Because what is the point if the regulator has a conditional approval saying, okay, we give this product a chance because we think there's people who benefit, but you have to do this and that. And then the payers, as you rightly said, say, "Niet, that doesn't help anybody." So we have to parallel the regulatory process of conditional approval with a managed entry agreement. And I think that is the only way forward to solve that. How you shape that, whether you tell the company, fine, we're paying a price for 2 years, but then, unless this or that happens, the price comes down or whatever, that is a matter for discussion. But of course it has to mirror the regulatory process.
Robyn?
And just to jump off Hans-Georg's comment and how to build this up front, you could not only have the HTAs and the payers and the regulators and the industry and the patients in the room up front to discuss yay or nay on the kinds of stuff that you would decide has a value proposition, but you could actually have up front the kind of conversation, not just that the company comes and says, this is what we're looking at, and we go, no, thank you, but say, actually, if the company could come and say, this is what we're thinking of, but what would you see would be the performance metrics that we would have to target for development. I mean, and we might be saying, well, it needs to be an effect size of X in Y, and we need to know this. So you could actually then have a known target to be shooting for, and you could develop your evidence plan and production, not just sort of blindly stumbling forward, sort of seeing what you get in the end is some statistically significantly different from zero, as I remember hearing a clinical reviewer back in Health Canada say recently, but actually try to select early and have a stakeholder system to do your go, no-go on whether to bother using your time and resources and patience and money to put into a product that maybe will be lackluster. Could we do a better job to line everybody up to tell you what we really need and how it needs to perform?
So are there any practical solutions for what do we need? Like, quite frankly, we've been talking about this for 5-10 years plus around the need for managed entry agreements and performance metrics. And now I would say, I think just based on my previous experience where I was before and where I am today, I do have more optimism around having these conversations. And I think there's been some key things that have happened within the drug reimbursement space to force some of those conversations. But sometimes it feels like we're circling around and we're not really quite landing that plane. So what's it going to take in order to actually get from where we are today, talking about these issues, to landing that particular piece? Hans?
So for us, the most successful way was always, let's try and do a few pilots. That lowers the angst barriers, that we will change the system tomorrow and we jump into the unknown. No, we declare, we do 1, 2, 3 pilots, controlled, calculated risk, and the best way of doing this was always when you look at a situation of high unmet need. So I mentioned earlier the antimicrobial resistance. That is an obvious candidate where you try out some new things. The orphan drugs, some of the very expensive orphan drugs are also a good playground for experimenting. So what we now have in place is a very, shall we say, preliminary in-principle agreement that payers would perhaps, or some in Europe would perhaps be willing to play ball, trying this kind of managed entry agreement in a situation, few patients, high price, high stakes, high risk, and high unmet need.
So Michele, can you see that operating in our current environment?
Absolutely. I think we're at a place where we're not starting from ground zero. We're starting from a place that a lot of these ideas have been put forward, have had a lot of good conversation. And so, yeah, we do need to use those pilots or use a scale and spread model where we just do this on one drug with one company, see how it works, learn from those things. That's how we got PCPA. We worked one product at a time through a series of growth and trial, and so you end up with a system and that's not perfect, but it will continue to evolve. So yeah, I think it's absolutely doable, and we're open to trying those sorts of things.
Great. Robyn?
Hans has discussed the pilot initiatives, which have been fabulous at the European Medicines Agency. Another set of smaller pilots have been going on in the sort of more academic space with the MIT NUDIGS project on adaptive pathways. And they do scenario design labs, which are, again, real-world assets that we all sort of huddle over and go through this spaghetti of discussions. And out pops, I'm not sure what sometimes, but it's a really useful exercise to start understanding how to try to make this work. And a lot of this stuff, again, we're transitional here. It's still, we're starting to nail the concepts, but the how-to is, I've heard from some of the people who are very much leading those things. Global companies are saying, okay, we get it. This is sort of something we need to be doing, but we just don't know how. So in the works right now, we're starting to think about working on kind of like a user's manual, a step-by-step, on the ground control for these sort of flights of concepts, and try to make them agnostic, actually, to data or drug or disease, and just actually have a method to start to put these things in place and get those discussions going so that it can be a little more concrete.
Mm-hmm. John?
I'm willing to put some timelines to be able to do this experiment. And I'm willing to go one step further. It cannot be with the entire PCPA. And I'll tell you the reason why. The PCPA is a negotiating body. It is not an experimenting body. I'm prepared to do it. One province who's willing to step up and to try these progressive pathways. To have alignment, unanimous alignment from the PCPA is asking for the impossible. I'm sorry, but it's asking for the impossible. You want pragmatic solutions. The EMA is not trying it with every single country across the EMA. They're trying it with maybe a couple of countries and to see if it works. So I am prepared, I'll put my hand up, and I'm prepared to commit to some timelines that we can experiment on this in a particular jurisdiction to innovate to the next level so that patients can get access to innovative medicines, innovative therapy in a timely fashion. I'm prepared to do that.
But is it maybe that we just haven't picked the right drug, possibly? Like, I think if we take a step back and talk about general principles around sort of what is the right product to move forward, like PCPA is responsible for maybe negotiating, is like they help develop these agreements and move forward, and you know, it's entrenched in the decision-making process, and I think it'll be hard to extract out of that. But I think if everybody's coming to the table with the similar principles, building off of, like, I think part of the challenge is when we're creating how-to manuals and stuff like that, are we just deferring a decision and not moving things forward?
No, I mean, I'll tell you, within company, if I was going to launch an innovative, a new experiment, a commercial experiment, I would have resistance across the organization abound to be able to do it. But if I isolate it to a particular geography in a controlled fashion where I can learn from it, and the intent is not about success and failure. The intent is about learning from this to further improve. 9 times out of 10, I can get it done. So narrowing the scope to be able to get faster is significantly a better outcome. It's not to take anything away from PCPA. I just think that experiments are not designed for that body. We need to find a different mechanism. And we've got a number of drugs that we can, I bet you, if we went back, looked at the number of drugs that have come in through, and to say, can we pick 2 or 3? And out of the 2 or 3, pick 1. And we could do it. Whatever company it is, it doesn't have to be my company, any company.
Robyn?
Yeah, I think what you both said sort of jumps into another question, which is, okay, clearly these sorts of flexible R to R kind of aligned pathways are not simple. And we're already not dealing with a simple system, and it's just getting less simple. So could we just thrash every drug through these sorts of methods? I'm thinking not so much. So, it's a lot of effort, but if you could understand the subset that may go through them, that's where your value may be. And that's where you loop right back to, if you can have those early discussions about, okay, here's a drug we have, we're thinking it could be good for this, and you talk early with everybody. If they go, we don't need that, we've already, but what we really need is this. It would be, you select early, you channel up front for needed good drugs with reliable evidence. And then if anything you can do to maximize that is worth it for that subset in the context, whatever it might be. And whether it's a European sort of centric approach or a United States one, it can look very different for Canada. Some contexts were more like Europe. Some contexts were more like the United States. So it depends, I think, much of the time on the context there. So that's really important to build in as well. But good, needed drugs that you can actually interpret the difference between a good and a bad drug, because you can actually read what the evidence is telling you, is going to be important regardless of your context.
Great, thanks. Hans, can you maybe comment a bit about how much pre-planning was needed in order to start some of these pilot projects in general?
So that is not something you do overnight. And I would agree that you have to do it with a coalition of the willing. Mm-hmm. You cannot wait for everybody wanting to jump on. So we said, for the HTAs, for example, we started with 4 or 5 across Europe, and I foresee the same will now happen with payers. Not everybody will be in the room. It will be 3 or 4 that are self-selected. We are open, but they have to self-select. Mm-hmm. And how long will it take? So the first, I cannot remember what the run-up time was for our parallel scientific advices, but it was at least a year or 2, maybe probably closer to 2-year preparation until the first real case started.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe what I'll do is just ask for sort of closing thoughts and comments. And Michele, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think for me, what I would say is what I'm hearing, and I think what the opportunity is we've got a system that's fairly complex, that has a lot of different interests and different systems and processes that are intertwined and interconnected. And I think the building the trust, building the relationships is critical. Transformation's a present event. So what we do now will shape and define those things for the future. And so I think we just need to start. I think you've got, again, find those coalitions of the willing, just start, be bold, take accountability for getting access to the right products to make difference for patients. It goes back down to the bottom line. We're all here to make better outcomes for our health system and individuals within it. And I think we can find those common grounds and just start.
Great, thank you. John?
I remain optimistic. I'm very optimistic. I think it is our responsibility to find the right solution. It's our responsibility. We have to do it. We don't have a choice. The reason we don't have a choice because the onslaught of products that are in development is not going down. Our CEO was presenting recently at a pharma conference, and he was saying there are 7,000 unique molecular entities today in discovery. 7,000. 70% of them are unique and new. So let's assume only a small portion of them make it through. This is not going away. We have to figure out a way that we narrow that white space and provide the right drugs for the patients in a timely fashion. Again, the innovation cycle is not complete until the patient gets access to the medication. And I just want you to know you have my commitment and the commitment of the industry association to figure out what this new social contract might look like. We're open to this, and I am reaching out to say, let's get engaged in true problem solving. Let's get engaged in true building of what the future might look like. And at the end of the day, It's not about us. It's about them. It's about the patients. It's about all of us. So let's not lose sight of that as well.
Thank you. Robyn?
I also am going to be optimistic and take us back to the dirty word uncertainty. It's called a dirty word because everybody usually freezes. You know, that keep calm and carry on poster? Well, it applies to uncertainty. It generates anxiety, but it's actually a real opportunity. We are in this transitional era, which is scary because it's unknown, but we have so many opportunities about where that track could go. And I'd like to leave it with whatever frameworks or methods or coalitions we form, that we always do this with that switch in the mindset that we need to come up with so we're not siloed, and that we also always try to strive for whatever tools and frameworks and opportunities to make us think more and better, not think less. So many of the tools people think, right, great, we'll slot it into an equation that'll help us just check that box. It is not about checking the boxes. It is about tools that will prompt us to think harder, to make sure that we're focusing on that fundamental objective as a system.
Great, thank you. Hans?
So I heard you say that we have been debating this for the past 5 or 10 years.
Plus.
And we do the same. So again, let me come back to what I just said. If you want to teach your child swimming, you can show him the movements. And you can do that again, and you can do it again, and you do it again. But there comes the moment when you have to get him into the water. Otherwise, there is no swimming without water. And the same goes for us here. You have to have one, what we call a live asset. So one company or several have to come forward and say, now let's try to do that different. And you have to find a way to lower the angst barriers of everybody, the industry, the regulators, the payers, the HTA, whoever is there, patients. Make it a safe haven. That's what we tried in the beginning. But without that, you will be here in 5 years again and not be able to swim.
Well, so I think it's a very important comment that you made, and I love to swim. I'm happy to jump into the pool. I think there's a bunch of others, maybe not with me, but with other groups that want to jump into that same pool. We have a grand old time. But I think we do need to move beyond, and we talk about social contracts, et cetera. But I agree with you, we need to figure out how to move into this space. And maybe it is coalition of the willing, but we need to move forward. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists. This has been a great conversation. I wasn't able to get to all the comments, and I appreciate the participation. I realize this is the end of a long couple of days that folks have had. So thank you for sticking out, and I think that just speaks to the importance of this particular issue, and that we really need to crack this nut and move it forward. So if you could please join with me and welcome thank our guests for a really interesting conversation. Thank you.